All right, good afternoon, everybody. This feels weird. It feels weird that it's in person, sorta. But I want to welcome you to the annual Faculty Book Celebration, sponsored by the Center for the Humanities and Washington University Libraries. So my name is Jean Ullman, and I'm a professor in the Department of African and African American Studies, and I direct the Center for the Humanities. On behalf of the Center and its staff, I'm pleased to welcome you to this special occasion during which we recognize academic and literary authorship. The first Faculty Book Celebration was convened by my predecessor, the founder-director of the book celebration, Professor Gerald Early, in 2002. And it has, over the years, become a cherished tradition, and I am especially delighted to host the celebration in this 20th year. The book celebration is certainly a highlight of our year at the Center. It's an opportunity for us to celebrate authors from across the faculty, but especially in the humanities and humanistic social sciences, where the book, whether it be a collection of poems or a scholarly monograph, is how we often engage our creative and scholarly communities and how we interpret and engage our world. Today's celebration is an opportunity for us to learn about each other's work that can be years in the making, and you'll see that if you look at the How I Made This Book stories. By the way, this year we had over 70 submissions. Yay for us, right? During some very difficult times. Now, last year's celebration was entirely virtual, and it was quite a challenge to assemble, but the Center's A-team staff pulled it off, led by Kathleen Fields, our communications chief, who managed to create virtual book displays and this virtual display of How I Made This Book. It took an incredible amount of work. Now this year, we are not fully out of the COVID woods, so I think the challenge for the staff this year has been even greater. How do we replicate last year's online experience and take some baby steps back toward an in-person celebration, minus, of course, the excellent food? So this year, we are here in person, but we also exist in two-dimensional form online. But by whatever form or format or platform you're joining us, welcome. Now, before we turn to a program, I want to extend my deepest thanks to the Center staff who have gone more than the extra mile to keep the Center, which has always thrived on in-person community, collaboration, lots of food, not just up and running, but extending into new areas of innovation and discovery. So thanks to Ignacio Infante, my associate director, Kathleen Fields, the publications and communications editor, Wendy Love Anderson, assistant director of academic programs, Tricia Sutton, administrative cluster supervisor, and the two newest members of our team, Alicia Dean. Alicia, where are you? Stand up and wave. Yeah. Administrative coordinator, and who with Kathleen did a lot of the heavy lifting on this that allows this hybridity to happen. And then in January, Laura Perry. Laura, if you would stand up, Assistant Director of Research and Public Engagement. Both have quickly made themselves indispensable. This afternoon, we'll hear presentations from two Washington University faculty authors, Deanna Montano, who I think I hired, assistant professor of history, and Julia Walker, who I did not hire, but would have, professor of English and Performing Arts and the current chair of Performing Arts. Then we will hear from our keynote speaker, Professor Charles Johnson, Professor Emeritus in English at University of Washington. We have a very full program. We have lots of people on Zoom, and I want to be mindful of that fact, so I want to cut to the chase by welcoming Professor Corinna Treidel to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Jean. So I'm here to introduce Deanna Montagno, and I have to say I'm a little intimidated because she's very accomplished. But I will get over myself, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. So she is an assistant professor of history She's a specialist in the history of modern Latin America, especially Mexico. She came to WashU in 2014 as a postdoc, and then began as a professor in the Department of History in 2016. And she's done a lot. I'm just going to pull out some of the highlights. So since arriving here, she has published several articles and a book, which is back there, called Electrifying Mexico, Technology and the Transformation of a Modern City. She has started a second project on the history of the Necaxa Dam and the hydroelectric complex built around it. She's taught courses, 8 courses, on everything from colonial Latin America to food history to the 1904 World's Fair here in St. Louis. She's really generous with her time, with others. She serves on all kinds of committees. So for the Humanities Center, she helps out with the Divided City Initiative. She has been a mentor to first-generation students here at WashU, to Latinx students. I could get up here and talk for 20 minutes about her service to different kinds of groups on and off campus. Her research is about the history of modern Mexico, but also the history of modern technology. And this is where my admiration for Deanna is really deep. She belongs to a new generation of historians of technology. So an older generation tended to write about cool inventions in the past, the clock, the pencil, the suspension bridge, steam-powered engine, things like this, and then trace how these devices fundamentally transformed human society. And there was always this kind of whiff of inevitability and progress in these stories. And they're nice stories. I like them. I've read them. But Deanna's not that kind of historian. She belongs to a new generation of historians who are reinventing the history of technology. She's what I would call a social historian of technology. She's interested in the ways that ordinary people like you and me, professors, housewives, politicians, workers, businessmen, engineers, how we take up technology and then transform it, adapt it, imagine it, transform it in our own lives. And she's also innovative in taking her story, and her particular story in the book she'll be talking about today is about electricity as a modern technology. But she's also very innovative, not just in telling the social history of that technology, but in taking the history of technology out of the United States and Europe, which is where that story has been told very well, and taking it to Mexico and new parts of the world. So my advice to you is listen closely. You're about to hear a really talented historian talk about a topic you probably have not thought about very much before, and leave you wondering how you could possibly have missed this story. Deanna.
Thank you, Karina, for that, and thank you, Jean, for hiring me. It's a pleasure to be here today. Yeah. Okay, so I have 10 minutes, so I will only give you a glimpse of the book, and hopefully you'll go out and buy it or secure it, whichever you prefer. So in our everyday lives, we spend little time thinking about electricity. Well, I think about it a lot. We inhabit electrified spaces and even expect them wherever we go. All around us, high voltage towers, transformers, posts, and power lines interrupt our horizon, weaving a web so familiar that we no longer recognize it. Only when electricity is missing does it become a newsworthy event. But what was it like for those first experiencing electrification? How did it impact their lives, their ambitions? How did it enter their sensorial registry? I answer these questions in Electrifying Mexico by delving into the making of electrified spaces and how people navigated their way through them. I argue that we must treat a society's relationship with electricity as unique and discrete. I call for grounded analysis to uncover the conditions that shape and characterize different experiences of modernity and their relationships to electricity. This approach allows historians to bring new actors into focus: discussion of people's doubts and fears about electricity, competition from other energy sources, legal complexities, and racial and class associations help see the adoption of electricity in the Mexican capital as neither inevitable nor linear. Instead, electrification is entangled in other histories of the city, in the choices that capitalinos, that is Mexico City residents, made in the transformation of their spaces. Mexicans and their energetic lives are at the center of Electrifying Mexico. But what does this grounding look like? How do we put individuals back in the histories of technological transformation? And the journey begins with the sources. And I'll be talking and walking you through the sources from just one chapter. One morning in 1912, the fate of Antonio Vasquez took a sharp turn. Manuel Rodriguez, inspector for the Mexican Light and Power Company, Mexlight, stopped by his house. Rumors had reached the inspector's office that someone in the area had been making and installing jumper cables to bypass and cheat electric meters. The inspector alleged that Vasquez not only used one at his house, but sold those cables for 75 cents. Vasquez maintained that he knew absolutely nothing about lighting, let alone electricity. He suspected the jumper cable had been planted by Inspector Rodriguez, motivated by vengeance, as in the past they had been love rivals. The stories of men like Vasquez and Rodriguez are not the ones historians usually tell about the dawn of electricity. Too often, technologies appear as black boxes in popular discourse or as fixed entities that irresistibly change society and culture. Missing are the people that employ those technologies and the ambitions that drove them, and how their aspirations and dreams were made real. If scholars talk about people and electrification at all, we generally talk about the great men or the companies who made it happen. In the National Archives in Mexico City, I stumbled across the 100-page-long case history of Vasquez and Rodriguez. It told a rich story of how electricity was transformed, managed, understood, policed, and even stolen. Vasquez's case sent me in a pursuit of other individuals charged with power theft. Over the next week, my camera sometimes overheated as I captured thousands of images of judicial documents that collectively detailed dramas of a society undergoing an energy transition. These judicial cases became a window to the everyday lived experience of electrification, one that allows us to see individuals who held their concerns, ambitions, needs, and desires. Individuals who imagined how electricity could transform the nation, its industries, along with their neighborhoods, and most commonly, their individual prospects. Vasquez was just one of the growing list of ladrones de luz, power thieves, who challenged the established parameters to secure electric energy. His was one of the 63 cases brought against individuals indicted for power theft and tried before the Federal District Higher Court between 1901 and 1918. The story of the ladrones help us understand the importance of looking at the subtle aspects of ordinary matters to appreciate the rules that govern everyday behavior. Inspections such as Rodriguez's were part and parcel of the Mexlight's efforts to police electricity. In 1907, the company established a department devoted to detecting illegal use with 35 inspectors who, like Rodriguez, made unannounced visits to commercial, manufacturing, and residential buildings, looking for meter tampering, unauthorized reconnections, or illegal hookups to power lines. In addition, inspectors surveilled overhead overhead power lines rooting out theft by walking the streets with their eyes fixed on the ever-expanding lines crisscrossing the metropolis. By carefully reading the court records of transgressions and resistance of electricity users, I was able to see electrification as a contested process. On the one hand, there was a company-dictated expectation of how individuals were to secure, use, and record their consumption of electric power. Electric companies like Mexlight set up the parameters of what I came to think of as an electric script through subscriber contracts. But in practice, the companies had little control over what would occur within the confines of homes, shops, and factories. In those spaces, authorized and unauthorized users, as the judicial cases attest, defied and actively subverted the company's script. Despite their intentions, companies realized that their scripts were not final decrees, but something of a first draft, subject to revision by the people who lived in the capital. Policing consumption required diligence, efficiency, and constant alertness. The push and pull over the script meant that Inspector Rodriguez's work was never easy, and theft could go undetected for days, months, and even years. Often, the inspector's only ally as they walked the city streets was the night's darkness. A bright light where none should have shined was a sure sign of theft. One September night in 1915, an inspector spotted an electric light at the house of Enriqueta Ruiz, who had no contract service. Upon knocking on Ruiz's door, a maid answered, but denied the inspector entrance, alleging that her boss was sick. As the inspector walked away from the house, he witnessed how candles were lit after turning off the electric light. As much as residents of the capital subverted the boundaries between legal and illegal use, inspectors keenly felt the cultural boundaries to policing electricity consumption. Could an inspector legitimately gain access to a private home? As inspectors knocked on doors and demanded entry, they were not approaching homogeneous structures, but spaces embedded with cultural and gendered meaning. What that space was and who occupied it mattered. Ladrones de luz included not only individuals like Vasquez, who ended up in court, but also individuals who sold or exchanged the technical skills required to make fraudulent connections, as well as some innovators or crafters who manufacture energy-saving mechanisms designed to bypass the electric meter's vigilance. Courts sought to squash these practices and protect the interests of large electric companies. But capitalinos, criminal or not, were not going to be passive participants in the city's electrification. At the level of everyday life, the early 20th century adoption of electricity confronted Mexicans with boundaries they frequently contested and transgressed altogether, as in the case of Ladrones de Luz. In this way, this former process of modernization resembles today's concerns about boundary-crossing technologies, including facial recognition or unmanned drones. Scenarios and experiences that fall outside the official scripts demonstrate that technology is never a black box and individuals are never passive actors. Despite the efforts of designers, manufacturers, and companies to predetermine a user's radius of action, technology is always a highly contested space full of humans. This becomes visible through the type of technologies people adopt, even when they do it through questionable means, or how they use technologies in new and unexpected ways, or in calling out devices and systems that threaten cultural conceptions of privacy, safety, justice, honor, and fairness. Even though Mexlight had, through its rates, limited investments, and service quality, conditioned the consumption of electric energy, the experience of users and non-users of electricity was never limited to the interaction with Mexlight. people became electrifying agents through interactions with the technology in a much wider context of use, in which they wrestle with the challenges and opportunities presented by electrification in creative ways. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deanna. And Corinna, I was remiss not to introduce you as the new chair of the history department. My apologies. I am now not going to introduce the chair of the English department because he had a conflict and is not here to introduce Julia. But he has written the words, and Ignacio here is going to read them. He's going to channel Vince, as difficult as that is.
Thank you, Dean. So, this is on behalf of Professor Vincent Sherry, and it's really my own honor to be able to introduce you, Julia. So this is like quoting a famous Pound professor in class. I am pleased and honored to introduce Dr. Julia Walker to this gathering. Especially pleased and highly honored since, as chair of English, I was competing with her as the new chair of PAD for the honor, but with her customary grace, she has deferred to me. So this gives me a chance to begin with to note how fluently and constructively Julia has moved between our two departments. She has contributed hugely to the scholarly and pedagogical and program missions of each unit. She has brought her professional emphasis in theater studies to the literature curriculum of the English department, and the literary emphasis of her textual work to considerations of performativity. This is, in fact, the broad framework of her now widely recognized and increasingly highly regarded scholarly writing. Building on the already recognized achievement of her first monograph, Expressionism and Modernism in the American Theater, Bodies, Voices, Words, of 2005. Her new and forthcoming book, Performance and Modernity Enacting Change on the Globalizing Stage, was just published in 2022, which we are here to celebrate. This new book makes decisive interventions in established understandings and critical breakthroughs in new and developing fields. Julia makes a critical difference to begin with in the established understandings or misunderstandings of modernist literary study, which all too often brackets and detaches theatrical art from the analytical frames of modernist scholarship, which in turn, or in wrong turn, has remained unduly focused in analysis of textual or visual or musical arts. Similarly, in the field of performance studies, Julia offers nothing short of a new theory of performance. This new understanding of performativity is grounded in the material, aesthetic ways that people understood and experienced a changing world. Julia tracks these understandings and experiences through 5 different periods, stretching from the early 19th century into and through the present. In 5 successive and linked microhistories, Julia connects the most significantly inventive theatrical developments of these 5 eras to technological and epistemological changes. In so doing, she shows us the vital importance of theater and performance to its contemporary culture, and in the longer story of modernity, whose changes are lived out and realized and made real in answering styles on stage. And these styles answer to developments as various as economic policy and transportation infrastructure and environmental conditioning. It is a stunning accomplishment. Indeed, Julia has produced a range of comprehensive references and a particularity of analytical frameworks that combine to provide a critical narrative that is at once expansive and focused. While each of these areas requires a great deal of specific archival work, the dominant and comprehensive concept is one of period specificity. This is a feature of the work which aligns it centrally and essentially with the academic discipline of modernist studies, which, with the sense of that term, concentrates on the ism of the modern, the self-consciousness of living in the just now of right here. Julia sees this acted out again and again on the modern stage. And we are all so fortunate to recognize and celebrate her achievement, just now right here. Please join me in welcoming Julia Walker.
Thank you, Ignacio. That was a really lovely introduction, and thank you to Vince virtually for those very kind words. I want to thank also Jean Allman for inviting me to present here. I will say that this event is one of my all-time favorite events every year here at WashU, so to be asked to present here is a real honor, and particularly with today's guests. So thank you very, very much for that. I'd like to begin, in terms of presenting my own work, with an anecdote, with which I begin, in fact, the book itself, because I think it neatly crystallizes what the book is about. And that is an account of an innovative production of Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, mounted by the great Victorian actor Sir Henry Irving in 1879. It's a notable production because Irving basically added a scene to Shakespeare's text. It was in pantomime, so he did not alter the sacred language, but it did change the way people understood that language in important ways, and that gets at the heart of what I'm after. This was a scene following Act 2, Scene 6, just after Shylock's daughter Jessica has eloped with Lorenzo and taken all of his money and jewels with her. In Irving's version, the gondola with the young people floats off stage, with the festive sounds of the merrymakers drifting off into the distance. Silence. Followed by the faint tapping of a cane as Shylock crosses over the wooden bridge on his return home. Irving stood in front of the darkened home and knocked on the door 3 times, pausing to raise his lantern and look for movement in an upper window. Then, upon realizing what has happened, he turned to the audience, and according to one eyewitness, across his features came a look of dumb and complete despair. It was a memorable production, largely because of Irving's sympathetic portrait of Shylock in what had long been a racist stage tradition of the comic Jew as scapegoat. Irving's performance evoked such sympathy from those in attendance that at least one audience member was able to hear a new meaning in Shylock's lines in the trial scene toward the end of the play. According to one of his intellectual biographers, Karl Marx was so struck by Irving's sympathetic performance that he added a footnote to a late revision of Capital. In the section where the political economist discusses the effects of industrialization on the worker's relationship to his own labor, Marx quoted Shakespeare, "You take my life when you do take the means whereby I live." I cite this anecdote because it's a good reminder of 2 things. One, that throughout most of its history, the theater was not considered a debased form of commercial entertainment, but was an important site of artistic and intellectual engagement. And 2, that what Marx and other attentive audience members did when they engaged these performances was to abstract meanings from the forms as they unfolded before their very eyes. That, in short, is the argument that my book makes, that performance enables new insights and new ideas to emerge into epistemological form. It enables a kind of conceptual gestalt to form around the materiality of bodies on stage. And because those bodies are in motion, performance enacts the processes of thought itself, allowing for ideas to coalesce into form or dissolve, like Prospero's mask makers, into airy nothingness. I observe that while this is a function of performance generally and is probably a transhistorical phenomenon, it becomes especially visible in the modern period, when the experience of sociocultural change happens so quickly that performance styles emerge one after the other in rapid succession. And you might think here of the cascade of isms in the avant-garde, symbolism, expressionism, futurism, etc. Part of what I try to demonstrate in this book is that when new forms of performance appear, they reveal how new experiences, thoughts, and feelings register first as embodied knowledge before emerging into consciousness and language through the aesthetic process. I don't have time today to elaborate on the individual case studies of my book's 5 chapters, but I'll mention briefly the topics they address to give you some sense of the epistemological formations that I track. Chapter 1, Money, looks at the move toward proto-realistic acting in the 18th century. This was a moment when what had been understood as an explicitly theatrical representation increasingly became registered as a verisimilar presentation of the real, with actors exchanging one for the other as they gave shape to a new understanding of value. In this moment, when modern banking practices were beginning to consolidate into the more or less reliable institutions we know today, exchange was indeed a site of anxiety both in the United Kingdom and the United States, where the value of real gold or silver specie was increasingly represented by paper banknotes. And it is this exchange of the representation for the real and the real for the representation that actors enacted on stage, helping their audiences comprehend and adapt to a modernizing economy. Chapter 2, The Railroad, also addresses a profound cultural change, this time in the way that the speed of the railroad transformed the experience of inhabiting space and time, which gets registered in the deepened stage space and accelerated narrative pacing of the naturalist stage. As I show, the landscape perspective described by cultural historian Wolfgang Schwiebelbusch that is enacted in Scene-Ending Tableau Vivant enlarges into the panoramic perspective of the sensation scene in the middle of the 19th century, where fixed character types get shunted into motion following the track of Konstantin Stanislavski's extended railroad metaphor that plots character motivation against the through line of the play's dynamic action. In Chapter 3, The Nation-State, I recuperate the history of the lost form of eurythmics, Émile Jacques Dalcroze's mass movement exercises, which lay the groundwork for modern dance. With discussions of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Star of Ethiopia pageant, the Ballet Russe's Le Sac du Printemps, and Rudolf Laban's opening ceremonies for the 1936 Berlin Olympics, I show how eurythmics helped forge a collective identity among various peoples, allowing them to set a gestalt around what Benedict Anderson famously refers to as the imagined community of the nation-state. Chapter 4, Advertising. Entering into the fray and partaking in the fisticuffs of avant-garde scholarship, I suggest that the provocations of figures such as Oscar Wilde, Aristide Bruant, and the Countess Elsa, among others, deliberately drew from the performance repertoire of the early advertising industry. From touts and shills to sandwich board men, these performers modeled the ways in which day-to-day social interactions were being transformed by consumer capitalism, especially among the middle classes whose so-called appetites were being manipulated by advertising's invisible hand. Bringing my argument up to date, I show how this historical tradition of the avant-garde persists in post-socialist China, where contemporary avant-garde artists such as Wang Jin, Zhu Fadong, and Ai Weiwei perform shanshai, the copycat logic of advertising in the black market, in order to bring capitalism's latest formation into visibility. And finally, Chapter 5, Air Conditioning, looks at the 20th century phenomenon of cold compressed air in relation to a changing aesthetics of reception with the rise of psychological realist film acting. Here I note that theaters were the first public buildings to feature the new technology of air conditioning, offering spectators the possibility of cross-racial identification by sealing the skin of their racialized identities while releasing their imaginations to cross over into the racial other on stage or screen. This paradoxical effect, I suggest, facilitated the widespread appeal of Marlon Brando's various white ethnic characters, as well as those of black actors such as Sidney Poitier, or in my case study of Orfeo Negru, Marpessa Dawn. The book's epilogue brings these 5 topics up to our own 21st century moment, which again is a moment of intense cultural change and profound political peril. Although we might think that the arts, and the performing arts in particular, are a luxury to indulge, a kind of frivolous entertainment that distracts us from solving the real problems at hand, I argue that this is precisely the moment when we should be investing in the arts, and the performing arts in particular, because when we find that we can no longer solve the problems in front of us by addressing their content head-on, it is probably because we need new forms with which to think new ideas that will help us find the solutions that we need. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thanks to both of the presenters. Let me start here with a short preface. For some time now, several of us in and around the center have been thinking through what has appeared to us this artificial division between intellectual or scholarly work in the arts and humanities versus creative and artistic practice. Is the distinction meaningful? For whom? In this afternoon's panel, and again, Ignacio, thank you so much for putting that together, it really seemed not to animate the craft of our colleagues who shared their worlds of creative and scholarly practice, which were for them one world, one of fully integrated ways of knowing. In the humanities here, it has long been built, the success has long been built through creative scholarship and scholarly creativity. The International Writers Program, the Creative Writing MA, the Digital Humanities, PAD, Film and Media, Music, and the list goes on. It's also worth remembering the very special history of the center, which under Gerald Early's leadership was birthed out of the International Writers Center in 2003. That center was founded in 1990 by William Gass, a novelist, a story writer, a critic, an essayist, a philosopher. Gass directed the center for 10 years before Early took it on. Early greatly expanded the breadth, the remit of the center's work when he built it into a humanities center. And many of us in the humanities have benefited greatly from that expansion. But the very core of the center has held firm in so many important ways, with a past, a present, and a future in which the creative and intellectual practice are inseparable. And that, colleagues and friends, brings me to Professor Charles Johnson, who until his retirement was the S. Wilson and Grace M. Pollock Endowed Professor of English at the University of Washington. Now, as we thought about scholars to invite for this year's celebration, we began in the abstract. We decided we wanted to invite someone for whom the question, intellectual or artistic, scholarly, creative, would be absolutely meaningless, would make no sense. Someone who embodied that original sort of vision that was there at the inauguration of the International Writers Center. Someone who defied disciplinary boundaries. Someone whose creative and scholarly work actually defied categorization completely. Charles Johnson jumped to mind in the concrete. And we were all over the moon when he accepted our invitation. When I explained to him the kinds of questions that we were interested in, he wrote back, particularly we were interested in during this strategic planning exercise, he wrote back, "I've spent my entire lifetime thinking about this. Sure, I'll come." I don't think I've ever been so challenged or so overmatched by someone's CV as I prepared introductory remarks. If I go into any detail on Professor Johnson's career, we will be here until commencement. So let me just focus on a few highlights. Charles Johnson is an incredibly prolific scholar and artist whose work ranges across discipline and content, form and format, unlike anyone, really. There must be others, but I can't think of them offhand. His early schooling happened not too far from here, just down the highway at Southern Illinois University, where he developed into a journalist, a top cartoonist and an illustrator whose work moved from student newspapers to the Chicago Tribune to Ebony. In 1970, you might also have found him on PBS teaching drawing on Charlie's Pad. But then he found philosophy and phenomenology, and by the early 80s was at Stony Brook studying continental philosophy with one of America's preeminent phenomenologists. His dissertation, which very quickly became a book, was Being and Race, Black Writing since 1970. But while honing his skills as a philosopher, Johnson was also trying his hand at writing novels, of which he wrote many. Novels that sought to bring together the African-American experience and the big questions that philosophers are so good at grappling with. What he has called African American philosophical fiction. With a PhD in philosophy, Johnson was hired in 1976 by the English department at the University of Washington, where he would spend his academic career, producing an outstanding body of work. In 1986, his short story collection, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, was shortlisted for the PEN/Faulkner Prize. He would go on to publish numerous other collections. But the short story was not the only form in which Johnson was to work. And I'm looking at Joel Miner here, and go look at the pop-up exhibit that he's done that sort of captures this extraordinary career. So besides the short story, many of you may also know that in 1990, Charles Johnson won the National Book Award for fiction for his what I consider to be an unparalleled novel on enslavement and the slave trade, Middle Passage. That was one of many novels, Dreamer, Oxherding Tale, that he has written over the years, all to wide acclaim. Now, over these very same years, he's been an award-winning screenwriter and a producer, including of Up and Coming and Booker, which won a Writers Guild Award. I'm going to leave out all of the extensive publications on Buddhism. The awards and acknowledgments Professor Johnson has garnered over the course of his career are really too many to mention, but let me just briefly note a MacArthur Genius Award in 1998, an NEA Fellowship, a Guggenheim in 2002. He was also named to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I have to also say that he is the first person I have met in person who has a learned society named after him, the Charles Johnson Society, which was inaugurated in 2003 by the American Literature Association. I'll stop there. Friends, colleagues, please join me in welcoming Charles Johnson.
Thank you. Well, first, I would like to say thank you for inviting me to share this time with you during the annual Faculty Book Celebration. I would also like to give my deepest thanks to Joel Miner, Professor Jean Allman, the Modern Literature Collection, and the D.B. Dowd Modern Graphic History Library. I feel both gratitude and humility for their accepting and then taking such good care of the papers. The literary and artistic archive I somehow managed to accumulate during 57 years of creative and intellectual work. Having these papers housed and preserved at a distinguished academic institution and made available to students and scholars is something that every serious artist and writer dreams about. But we never know, of course, if the work stretching from juvenilia in our teens to our creative and intellectual efforts in our 70s will have some value for future generations. I have to confess that since the age of 17, I've lived my life in libraries, which I love, because they are almost like sacred places for me, places that preserve, quote, the best that has been known and said in the world, as Matthew Arnold might say. And that experience of love and passion is going to be at the center of my remarks today. Last summer, on August 1st, Professor Allman invited me to present the keynote address for this event. Her hope was that I might be able to address, quote, the artificial yet enduring divide in the academy that separates intellectual or scholarly work from what is considered to be artistic or creative work in practice. I think Professor Allman had a hunch that this subject would be of interest to me, but she really couldn't know how all my life I've been fiercely opposed to putting labels on ourselves and others, or how at every stage of my life, which I've had to reinvent about 3 times, I've resisted the artificial boxes and categories we place people in for the sake of convenience. Those labels and boxes limit our intellectual life, our imagination, our dreams, our talents, and close off explorations in the arts and sciences, so much so that in 1987 I told an interviewer that The great fight in life and literature always is to prevent some form of idea or situation from enslaving you. It's to keep your mind open and your eyes open and your life open, to find ways to not being limited. Today, I want to emphasize three interrelated things that I feel are time-honored antidotes for the artificial divide between the work of the scholar and the work of the artist. One is passion. Another is endless curiosity about the world that we live in. The third is a recognition of the profound interconnectedness that characterizes all our lives, what the late great spiritual teacher Thich Nhat Hanh called interbeing. This is going to be my emphasis today, because on September 12, 2003, at the invitation of one of my former students, David Guderson, author of Snow Falling on Cedars, I had a troubling experience I've never forgotten. That day, I delivered a lecture titled Storytelling and the Alpha Narrative for a literary organization on Bainbridge Island in Washington State. During the Q&A, I urged, as I always do, the audience to find their passion. But afterwards, as I chatted with different people, a gentle, soft-spoken, middle-aged black man approached me. He said, "I've been searching all my life for my passion, and I haven't found it." I was at a loss for how to respond to him, or what I might say to help him, because a passion for doing something is, at least in my experience, finding something one loves. And in my life, I've loved so many things that my challenge was always how to bring them all together, unified in a single life. As I rode the ferry from Bainbridge Island back to Seattle, this gentleman's situation lingered in my mind. Had he really never found anything to be passionate about? To love unselfishly and desire to serve? As the ferry drew closer to the glittering lights of the city, the moonlight struck waves on Puget Sound, and I started to remember how drawing and looking at visual art from all corners of the world was all I ever wanted to do during elementary school and high school. I remember spending whole afternoons blissfully seated before the three-legged blackboard my parents got me for Christmas, drawing and erasing until my knees and the kitchen floor beneath me were covered with layers of chalk, and the piece in my hand was reduced to a wafer-thin sliver. My art, then literature classes, were the ones where I came alive. And I think I was generally a poor student in my other subjects because at the time they didn't ignite my imagination and curiosity as they did in later life. After 2 years of study with cartoonist and mystery writer Lawrence Laurier, I began publishing illustrations and comic art when I was 17, and also short stories, and I continued working at this for 7 intense years that resulted in every kind of comic art, a cartoon collection called Black Humor, and a how-to-draw PBS series called Charlie's Pad, both in 1970. When I look back on those years, I know that as a teenager, I was obsessed with publishing and seeing my work in print. I was always ready to draw anything for anybody. But why was drawing such a passion? Later in life, as I was studying Eastern philosophy, I think I became more aware of why creative and intellectual work was so addictive. I was reading a book by Christmas Humphreys that had the title, Concentration and Meditation. Concentration is, of course, the first stage in the practice of meditation. In his book, Humphreys said, if one is trying to do something really well, one becomes first of all interested in it and later absorbed in it, which means that one forgets oneself in concentrating on what one is doing. In other words, when I was drawing or writing or concentrating on any problem, I had the liberating pleasure of forgetting myself for a little while. It was also when I was in my teens that I read an interview with one of my literary heroes, Ray Bradbury. He too began publishing in his teens, and he told an interviewer that when he submitted his first story to one of the pulp science fiction magazines, they accepted it. But he also got a surprise. They sent him a check, money for his story. Before that moment, Bradbury said he didn't know writers were paid for their work. But he also realized that he would be writing stories whether anyone paid him for them or not. I identified very much with that anecdote from Ray Bradbury. What I learned, indeed had to learn, as a visual artist, is a curious and quite wonderful truth about creative work, whether it is visual or literary. The truth is captured in an observation by John Muir, who said, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe." If I could sit down now with the gentleman I met on Bainbridge Island, I would tell him that there is a logic, a teleology or direction hidden away in our passions and talents, one that begins with the joy that comes from trying to do our work well. This joy, or passion if you like, naturally leads to wanting to know, experience, and understand the creations of others, their methods, and how their minds work. Like a thread that is pulled on a garment or the limbs of a tree branching out, you are inexorably led from your own intellect, your own individual canvases, to the work of others in your field, present and past, from all cultures and countries, all traditions and styles, and all periods of human history, regardless of the race, class, or gender of these creators. The necessity for this is both selfish and unselfish. I should say selfless and selfish. The first, just because one loves the experience of beauty, which is a form of truth, anywhere one finds it. But there is selfishness here too, insofar as the Catholic experience the rich diversity of art, visual or literary. Art that is our human inheritance expands one's own technical skills for solving problems that creators have universally faced in composing their compositions. When I think about the writers and artists I've been fortunate to know during my life's journey, people like novelist and medievalist John Gardner, my UW colleague painter Jacob Lawrence, and my late friend, playwright August Wilson, I realized that they all had a common love for the creative process, despite the differences in their fields. It's not quite accurate to describe this love as being similar to a career or a career choice, because it is not something the writer or painter arbitrarily chooses. More accurately, it should be seen as a way of being in the world. As with the other things we deeply love and are ready to make sacrifices for, the artist surrenders to it and to all the demands of a life devoted to creating, which means having a desire to understand both the lives of other artists and the critical history and intellectual foundations from which their works arise. In other words, we find ourselves forever thinking and talking passionately about literary art to better understand what we love and sometimes dislike, which segues into writing about new works as a book reviewer and literary critic, to more formalized and scholarly reflections that analyze the works we love, to wanting to share what we have learned about something we love with others through teaching, and finally to encouraging others to add to the body of creations in the fields that are dear to us by judging contests, publishing others, creating awards for them, and mentoring. A creative life is all of one piece, and each activity, professional and personal, enriches the others. Everything flows from the same source, the love of art. All art. For the kind of writer or artist I've just described, what might have been selfish or ego-driven at the onset of his or her career gives way, as is always the case with love, to the simple desire to humbly serve and possibly enrich, if we are lucky, some aspect of culture in our time. So, all of that is just to say, the love of art led me to the love of philosophy. That particular passion was ignited when I was 18 years old, and although I went off to college as a professional cartoonist and illustrator and majored in journalism, I had to take a required course in philosophy. Actually, I took 2 courses. One was required, Introduction to Logic, and the other was an elective, a course on the pre-Socratic philosophers. My journalism professors wisely understood that if one is going to become a newspaper reporter, then he or she better know something about the logical fallacies appearing in arguments by politicians and also in advertising. With that course, I felt I'd been given an antidote for the illogical statements I remember people making all around me when I was growing up. I suddenly felt empowered to defend myself from those who hoped to manipulate my thoughts and feelings. But it was the other course on the pre-Socratics that cemented my lifelong devotion to philosophy. That large lecture course was taught by a young professor named John Muir, who was beginning his first year at the university. Somehow, I don't know how, and with a gift he had, I don't know what, Dr. Howey was able to sing the ethical questions the pre-Socratics wrestled with in such a way that he made me realize for the first time that many of the social and political issues I was drawing editorial cartoons about in the late 1960s were issues debated and discussed with sophistication 2,000 years before the birth of the American Republic. He made me see that the quality of the questions we ask determines the quality of the answers we get. The great themes of ancient Greek philosophy about what might be the good, the true, and the beautiful became a lens through which I began to look at the world. And this early exposure to philosophy convinced me that I would be engaged with philosophy for the rest of my life, and asking myself at every stage and every season of my life, how should I live? What can I know? What counts as knowledge and wisdom? But it was there, in the field of philosophy, that I encountered the false and artificial division between scholarship and creative work that Professor Allman invited me to address today. In graduate school, I discovered that there was sometimes an outright hostility to the idea that philosophy and the arts have any relationship at all. This lack of appreciation was so much or great in the 1970s that when I was a graduate student and working on my doctorate, I copied into my writer's workbook at the time a quote from a letter Schiller sent to Goethe, which I found myself identifying with, even though it is based on a rather odd instance of experiential apartheid. Schiller said, "My understanding works more in a symbolizing method, and thus I hover as a hybrid between ideas and perceptions, between law and feeling, between a technical mind and genius. The poetic mind generally got the better of me when I ought to have philosophized, and my philosophical mind when I wished to poeticize." Professor Michael Boylan at Marymount University, my co-author for the book that we did together, Philosophy and Innovative Introduction, Fictive Narrative Primary Text, and Responsive Writing, earned his PhD at the University of Chicago. He is a very prolific novelist and poet, as well as being a very creative and equally prolific philosopher. In one of his recent essays, Dr. Boylan recalled that, quote, "There were some philosophers at Chicago who encouraged the intersection of fiction and philosophy, including Paul Ricoeur and Arthur Adkins, but the general attitude was that I should keep my passion for fiction a secret. Other prominent members of the department advised me to adopt a pen name if I wanted to continue doodling stories. Real philosophers," he was told, quote, were interested only in making claims through the analysis of language, logic, and science. There's something very wrong with this picture. In 1953, Yale philosopher Brand Blanchard delivered the Adamson Lecture at Manchester University. That lecture addressed some of the problems with the way many people view the practice of philosophy, and his lecture was later published as a lovely little book titled On Philosophical Style. Blanchard points out that some philosophers have seen feeling and the techniques of literary craftsmanship as being dangerous. One reason is because concrete examples, illustrations, or empirical content, and especially metaphors, which are so important for good storytelling and in the visual arts, can be risky because concrete things are complex. And if you offer one as an example, you might pick out the wrong point in it. Kant was so convinced that this would happen that for the most part he deliberately avoided using illustrations. And in his work, Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, Kant wrote that, quote, "To be subject to emotions and passions is probably an illness of mind because both emotion and passions exclude the sovereignty of reason." That statement, we know, is simply wrong. Emotions and passion, properly understood, do serve reason. Concepts have an affective quality, an emotional tone. The compound German word for this is Begriffsgefühl, just as feelings in the Heideggerian sense disclose an analytic dimension, which is to say, feelings bring forth profiles of the world that are meaningful, so that these two experiences, ideas and feelings, cannot be as easily separated or segregated as Schiller believed. Taking this a step further, J. Lowenberg, writing about Hegel's dialectic, reminded us that, quote, "Ideas and beliefs, too, may be pretentious, pedantic, fantastic, bizarre, grotesque, inept, perverse, reckless, blind, and blatant." As a philosopher trained in the continental tradition or phenomenology, I've always felt that Kant's statement was wrong. If one understands the rich histories of Western and Eastern philosophy, it comes as no surprise that the expressions we call philosophy can assume many literary and even visual forms. They range across Plato's use of dialogue, a dramatic form of expression, Nietzsche's aphorisms, Montaigne's essays, Schopenhauer's Parable of the Porcupines, Sartre's novels and plays, Aesop's fables, the sermons of Martin Luther King Jr., Buddhist sutras, the poetry of Jean Toomer in his book Essentials, Japanese tales of Zen masters, the beautiful illustrations known as the 10 ox-herding pictures, the slokas, verses, and the Bhagavad Gita, and the wisdom books of the Bible, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes. In principle, then, there is no literary form that cannot be the capacious vehicle for robust philosophical exploration. In his notebooks from 1935 to 42, Albert Camus, who earned in 1936 our equivalent of a master's degree in philosophy, notoriously pointed out that, quote, "Feelings and images multiply a philosophy by 10. People can only think in images. If you want to be a philosopher, write novels." That insight is not dissimilar from philosopher Martha Nussbaum's observation in Love's Knowledge on philosophy and literature when she informs us that, quote, "We have never lived enough. Our experience is, without fiction, too confined and too parochial." And my own mentor, John Gardner, taught that plot is, in serious literary art, is the writer's equivalent to the philosopher's argument. William James once described philosophy as, quote, "a peculiarly stubborn effort to think clearly," end quote. In his lectures, Blanchard helped us to see how the process of trying to, quote, think clearly is shared across creative and scholarly work. Blanchard said that whenever he, William James, was engaged in any considerable piece of literary composition, his letters to his friends grew full of groaning over the slowness and arduousness of his progress. He assured them that working all day and rewriting half a dozen times has only yielded him a page and a half of manuscript. Everything comes out wrong with me at first, James said, but when once objectified in a crude shape, I can torture and poke and scrape and pat it till it offends me no more. I know from experience that this is the same process we all face when writing a philosophy dissertation, doing a drawing, or anything that requires the effort of trying to think clearly. And I've met many rigorous and creative philosophers who were also important novelists, one being William Gass, who was a distinguished professor here at Washington University and one of my heroes when I was in graduate school. So I've always seen the literary as a potential site for philosophical agency. I've never seen ideas as existing in some abstract realm floating high above human experience. Rather, I see ideas as originating in the historical muck and mud of our daily experience, cloaked in the immediate particulars of this world, and only later do we abstract them for the purpose of study and reflection. So what does this philosophical writer and novelist do? I simply try to return those ideas to the palpable world of experience from which they first sprang. If philosophy is direct discourse, then literary art, as Michael Boylan has long pointed out, can be seen not as play or frivolity, but possibly as a form of indirect discourse that makes claims or judgments about this world and how it works. In conclusion, what I'd like to do is refer you all to a simply wonderful book called The Writer's Brush, Paintings, Drawings, and Sculpture by Writers. I don't know if you know this book or not. It's edited by Donald Friedman. It contains paintings, drawings, and sculpture by 200 of the world's most famous writers, and essays by, guess who, William Gass and John Updike. It's a book that forever shatters the artificial divide between intellectual work and creative work. And I think it should be shared with all of your students. Thank you for your patience.
Well, that settles that. Does anybody have any questions or comments they'd like to share? We have a little time. I don't know, online people. Sure. Bill.
Hi, thank you very much for that talk, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me here.
So I think that you've convinced us, as have some of the other presenters, that there really isn't an intellectually or creatively legitimate, firm distinction between creative work and intellectual work. To what can we account the prevalence and persistence of this idea beyond professional jealousy, the production of scholarly narrowness, institutions that isolate thought? You could talk about big philosophical shifts in another example, but practically, why do we turn to the mistaken idea that these things are separate?
Well, I was thinking about this last night. Why does this persist? And when we had our panel earlier today, which is a wonderful panel, by the way, all the participants contributed from their discipline insights about the creative process. When we had our panel, I think we all kind of agreed, especially me and Gerald Hurley, that to get good at something, you've got to do a lot of it. You've got to do it for a long time. It's a skill. It's like learning how to make a chair or a podium. It's like, it's techne. It's learning how to do something. Hours and hours and years of practice for a dancer who was on our panel, for a boxer, for an athlete. You have to invest this time in order to get something done well. Now, I've done different things over the course of my lifetime, but I've invested more time in some of them than I have in others. And so, I'm never going to be a great essayist like James Baldwin, okay? But I'm a pretty good essayist. I can get by, and I'm happy with that. I don't aspire to be a great essayist. I do care about the novel and the short story a whole lot. And I care a whole lot about philosophical black fiction wherever I find it. So my time has gone into that. But as a young person, I tried different things. I tried this and that. I tried writing poetry. It was all bad when I was an undergraduate. I tried my hand at painting. I didn't go to art school like I wanted to, so I could never get the training. So really, what happens with us is we find ourselves in conversation on a daily basis with year in and year out with people who do the same thing we do. If I had taught philosophy, as I did as a graduate student, I'm hanging out with other philosophy teachers and grad students. When I started teaching at the University of Washington and focusing my energies on, novels and all of that we were teaching in the creative writing program, I'm hanging out with writers and novelists and poets. It's like the amount of time that you invest in something. And so basically, think of physics. The physicists, they're getting great ones in the 20s, getting up at the top of their day, all the way through lunchtime to at night, and they're thinking the same questions and the same problems, and they're invested in it over time, in years, and passionate about it, right? Well, there isn't a whole lot of time to get good at making furniture. But, some people do. Some people have a hobby or something. But that's it. It's not your primary focus. Does that make sense? It's the amount of time that we put into something and our colleagues who we spend time with that probably leads to us saying, well, this person's not put enough time into this particular discipline, right? They belong over here. I don't know if that's an explanation that crosses, all instances of this, but I think that's what we tend to drift into. I think they're artificial for a lot of people. I don't like being, I'm a black American, okay, so I don't like being put in a box of any kind, racial or any other sort. I'm a human being, first and foremost, and out of whatever I do, it comes out of my humanness. It may come out of my history as a black American, but that's one dimension. That's just one dimension of the totality of my being. I hope that didn't get too far off, of course. Andy?
Well, I just want to ask you about the moment where you decided, I'm going to write a novel, right? And I'm thinking about the experimentation that it sounds like you did so much experimentation in all kinds of forms. And so, what was that moment like, and how did you decide that was where you were going to...
Okay. I went off to college in 1966. The 60s were a really tempestuous period, right, for creativity and music and everything else. So the people I hung out with they were musicians, would be, the next Rolling Stones, or whatever, that's what they wanted to be. Somewhere, there's one guy who was a fantastic guitarist. He was my roommate. And then another buddy was writing novels. He wrote 6 that he never published as an undergraduate. And, others, poetry. I went to high school with Franklin Buzz Spector, okay? His name, he was Franklin Spector in high school, and then he got to college, we were in college together, he became Buzz Spector. He is now an accomplished conceptual artist. I hung out in my late teens, with people who are artists. So it was just natural when an idea just came to me for a novel. I'm a cartoonist, I'm doing illustrations for things, I'm a journalist. This idea came to me for a novel and nagged me and wouldn't leave me alone. So I figured, if I'm going to get a good night's sleep, I got to write this thing. So I wrote it over the summer, the first novel. and it was terrible. Okay, I didn't know what I was doing. I hadn't studied the novel. I hadn't refocused that way. But that led me to writing 6 apprentice novels. Each one I said, okay, I'm going to get better at characterization in the next one. I'm going to get better at structure in the next one. I'm going to get better at the possibilities of poetic language in the next one. By the time I'd done 6, and I was starting the 7th, I ran into John Gardner. And he said, what do you want with me? You can write. I said, well, yeah, I can do a novel in 10 weeks, right? 10 pages a day, sure, take off on the weekends for revisions. But he said, you can write. I said, yeah, but here's something I hear from editors that I could get better at. They say I could get better at voice and rhythm. And he said, oh, I can help you with that. Okay, so, looking over my shoulder, that was the one thing that was elusive. What is literary voice? I really only learned what that was by reading his fiction. Narrative ventriloquy, how you shift voices the way that somebody does, in a Punch and Judy show, you can do that. We have many voices inside of us. And rhythm, that's music. That's the music of the prose, from sentence to sentence and paragraph to paragraph. I could get to that quite easily. So, the transition was easy, but I really knuckled down on the novel, on storytelling. And, there's other areas that I didn't invest that much time in. So it's about passion. To me, it always is about passion. Yeah.
Anybody else? I have a question from online.
Yeah, oh.
A virtual question.
Oh, okay.
Were there times in your career when you felt professional or institutional pressure to fit into one disciplinary or artistic category? And if so, how did you find a way to hold on to your multidisciplinary passion and perspective in the face of those pressures?
Well, it's a fight, okay? I'll just be honest about it. It's a fight. I was trained to teach philosophy. That's what my PhD is in, but I was hired in an English department. Now, I was not going to get early tenure in 3 years, and early full professorship after another 3. I wasn't going to get that for publishing cartoons, okay? No one's going to give me tenure for doing editorial cartoons and drawings and illustrations. So I had to reinvent myself. Whatever were the standards in creative writing circles, MFA programs and English departments, I had to meet those. I had to meet those terms that other people established and go beyond them, but never forget where I started. I always want to draw. Nobody's going to take that from me. I mean, since a kid, the time I was a kid, with a blackboard, I wrote, with the chalk. That's me, and nobody was going to, appreciate it, but it doesn't matter. Same thing in the literary world. I mean, how many people are philosophers in creative writing circles? So, you got to follow your talent. That's the title of this lecture. I don't care what's going on out in the world politically. I don't care what's going on in the world socially. Let your talent be your guide. It'll show you what to do next. Nobody else can do that. Only what you feel deeply in terms of, I have to create this. This novel is not going to let me alone, like the first one I did, until I sit down and do it. Maybe terrible, but okay, let me figure out now how to write a novel. Follow your talent first and foremost. See, God-given talent. That's why you got it. You know that old story about hiding your talent? Don't do that. That doesn't work. Let your talents come out and lead you wherever they have to go. And that takes courage, and it takes tenaciousness and a kind of pig-headedness, sometimes in the face of editors who don't understand what you're doing because they're chasing the last bestseller, and they want your book to be like that. They don't want it to be groundbreaking because, it's about sales. Hey, heck with that. You know why you're doing something. It's to enrich culture, literary culture, visual culture, whatever it is. That's why you're doing this. That's what I would say.
Professor Johnson, thank you.
Thank you all for having me here.
good wine and nice appetizing things. We have none of that. We have hand sanitizer. That's all we got. But please take some time to look at the display of books. If you're in a rush and you need to go, please go online. Kathleen has just done another marvelous collection of stories about the stories of the stories that we tell. So I hope you can spend some time there. And thank you all again for coming in person.